Hello, everyone. Peace to you all, and welcome to Harvard and Slavery Then and Now, which is a student organized convening that connects past and present struggles to shed light on the life and afterlife of slavery at Harvard. My name is Jared Martin Drake, and I am one of the students who organized today's convening. My fellow organizers will introduce themselves later on. As a matter of housekeeping, portions of today's event will be recorded. So you do not want your face to appear, feel free to turn off your video. If I may, I would like very briefly to contextualize how and why we got here today. But in trying to figure out how to open such a convening as this, words fail me. We live in a world where Black girls and Black women sleeping in their homes are murdered by marauding mobs of white men behind blue badges. From Brianna to Ayana, where Black women in their cars are open targets for lynching, like Rakia and Sandra, where Black women in need of care and assistance are instead greeted with gratuitous violence, such as Tanisha and Renisha. Listen to these names: Sandra, Tanisha, Brianna, Rakia, Renisha, Ayana, Sandra, Tanisha, Brianna, Rakia, Renisha, Ayana. How can we inhabit a world where Black girls and Black women being stolen by the state is seen as acceptable, as part of the price of doing business? The repetitions and rhythms of anti-Black violence demonstrate that the past is always present. We are possessed by it and it possesses us. That's the essence of why we're here today, to talk about that possession by the past in the present. To be more specific, the possession of pictures. No one understood the past, present, possession, and pictures better than Toni Morrison, who in her Liberation love letter, Beloved, explains the concept of rememory. She writes, quote, "If a house burns down, it's gone, but the place, the picture of it stays, and not just in my rememory, but out there in the world. Even if I die, the picture of what I did or knew or saw is still out there, right in the place where it happened. If you go there and stand in the place where it was, it will happen again. It will be there for you, waiting for you, even though it's all over and done with. It's going to always be there waiting for you." Saidiya Hartman would later put it this way in her 2002 essay, The Time of Slavery, where she states, quote, "The distinction between the past and the present founders on the interminable grief engendered by slavery and its aftermath. How might we understand mourning when the event has yet to end? When the injuries not only perdure, but are inflicted anew? Can one mourn what has yet ceased happening?" Christina Sharp adds to the work of Morrison and Hartman in her book, In the Wake, by telling us, quote, "In the wake, the past that is not past reappears always to rupture the present." Sharp then poses a set of questions that we can think with for today's convening. She queries, how does one memorialize chattel slavery and its afterlives, which are unfolding still? How do we memorialize an event that is still ongoing? Might we instead understand the absence of a national slavery museum in the United States as recognition of the ongoingness of the conditions of capture? End quote. The conditions of capture. That is why we are here today, to confront them, to challenge them, and to, of course, bring about their demise. Our outline to confronting these ongoing conditions of capture is as follows. The convening will take place in two parts. In part one, we will commence with a grounding conversation featuring Tamara Lanier, the courageous litigant who has taken Harvard to court for the images of her enslaved ancestors, Renty and Delia. Tamara will be joined by her daughter Shanrell, as well as Dr. Caitlin Hopkins, who was the research associate for the Harvard and Slavery Project from 2017 to 2019, and who was also a part of the university's Studying Slavery Consortium. In part two, student researchers and organizers will present their work pertaining to the past and presence of slavery at Harvard. Thank you everyone for attending, and we will move into panel one. So I'll just read a brief bio of all of the participants in panel one, and then we will go into a list of questions that I, as a moderator, have for them, and then we will leave 10 minutes for questions from the audience that you can send directly to me in the chat box. So Tamara Lanier is a tireless champion for truth and justice, where her advocacy work has taken her to many parts of the state of Connecticut, the country, and even the world. Ms. Lanier has also traveled the country promoting the need for a national dialogue relative to slavery and its impact on society. With the assistance of the nationally acclaimed civil rights attorneys, Michael Koskoff and Benjamin Crump, Ms. Lanier has filed a landmark reparations lawsuit against Harvard University, forcing this nation to reckon with its history of slavery in the United States, and also asking the courts to consider who owns the past. Caitlin Hopkins, Ph.D., was the research associate for the Harvard and Slavery Project from 2017 to 2019, and part of the university's Studying Slavery Consortium. Dr. Hopkins has twice taught an undergraduate seminar on Harvard and slavery. And as I mentioned, we're also going to be joined by Ms. Lanier's daughter, Shanrell. So I thought that the first question that I would put out to the panel is, how would you characterize recent conferences, books, op-ed pieces, installations, or other initiatives that Harvard has sponsored around the topic of the university and slavery?
Well, I will start. I have this image of 2000. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me? I have this image from the conference in 2017, which both myself and my daughter Shanrell attended. And I can tell you that, first of all, I had to fight to be able to be a part of that. Not to be a part, but to witness it. When I learned of the conference, I contacted Harvard, who had long since known of my story. They were very familiar with all that I had alleged. They had documents at the time substantiated that I was Renty's granddaughter. I had correspondence from the then president, Drew Falls, who said, if there's any events, you know, we will keep in contact with you. But I never heard anything. I was always the initiator. But when I learned of this conference, I reached out and I said, I'd like to attend. And I was declined. I was told that the registration was full and you couldn't attend. I did persist, and I was able to get a space for me and my daughter. And I can say when we walked in, both of them were immediately gripped. We stopped. We were stopped in our tracks by the image of Renty that was on the stage. It was greater than a billboard size picture of Renty. And so we, at that point, without even communicating with each other, were shocked. We were angry. We felt that there was a further exploitation of Renty. The event was held at the Radcliffe. And for all of you that don't know, that is named after the wife of Louis Agassiz. So it was like an initial slap in the face to first have to fight to witness this conference, and then secondly, to walk in and receive the punch in the gut by this larger than life exploitation of Renty. And so my daughter and I were completely taken back by that. We sat through the first half of the conference before we recognized that this was an affront to the title, which they featured the discussion about reparations. I expected to hear real conversation. I expected to hear Harvard engaging in full dialogue and disclosure about their ties to slavery, and none of that happened. I say that what I have experienced in my 10 plus years of reaching out and interacting with Harvard, it's almost as if they're engaging in this syndrome of denial and deception. They publicly talk about a commitment to learning from their historical ties and embracing it and moving forward with, in a sense of harmony and oneness, but everything they've done has been divisive. And so, you know, and I'm at a loss to understand Harvard's response, in a sense that with them being the leading institution in the world, and to not only perpetrate this fraud about who Renty is, but to be so dishonest and deceitful about it, undermining their integrity, not only of the university, but their students, their alums, and all that are associated with it. So it troubles me greatly. I can say that the books that have been published, I want to first thank you for the opportunity to talk about that, because another frustrating experience for me, in that when I know that the people who are responsible for writing these books have emails from me about my story, have a draft copy of all of my research that definitively links me to this man in the image, and to read over and over. And mind you, I didn't buy the book, but I did read some of the excerpts from off the internet. Over and over, they say that there's no information about the people in the daguerreotypes. That's so patently untrue, dishonest, and disrespectful. They know my story. Every single one responsible for this book knows my story. And I have proof that I have sent them the information, but they continue to act as if it doesn't exist. And again, what this suggests to me, that this book not only perpetrates a fraud, but it's actually an attack on intellectual, scientific credibility. And it's just amazing that this is coming from one of the most prestigious universities in the world.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Hopkins, that's a great lead-in for you. How would you respond to that question? And building off of Ms. Lanier's comments about the conference and about the book and sort of like the scholarship around Harvard and slavery.
Sure. Thank you for having me, and thank you to Ms. Lanier for your, your courageous work and for persevering in the face of, a giant institution that's set against you. So I would say that Harvard's conferences, books, what they've done around Harvard and slavery should be characterized as slow, defensive, and insular. So slow. Other universities have done similar work and are doing similar work, are 20 years ahead of Harvard in doing this work. And one of the tactics that Harvard uses to delay the work on Harvard and slavery is to keep restarting, right? To go back to the beginning, to pretend that this work hasn't been done, to ignore research that has been done, like Ms. Lanier's research, and pretend that you're starting from zero when that's not the case. And so there's a new commission run through Radcliffe that's starting again with the Harvard and slavery work. And when we see the job postings for what they want people to do, it seems very much that what they're asking is for people who are going to redo research that's already available to them, as a way of delaying and not actually having to talk about things like reparations, restitution, that sort of thing. It's very defensive. Harvard is not reacting in the same way as a lot of other institutions are. So at places like UVA and William and Mary, all of the university studying slavery projects have problems with them. None of them is perfect. There's nothing that's working 100%. But at places like UVA and William and Mary, they're really reaching out to communities. And so things like the UVA monument that they just unveiled in the spring was the result of a lot of, just like a lot of work within the descendant community of people living in Charlottesville who came to, coffee breakfasts and listening sessions and just a lot of collaboration. And Harvard has, in contrast, been very defensive and has sort of slapped up some plaques and did that conference, which was really slapped together at the last minute as a way of getting credit for doing work without actually doing the work. So like at the conference in 2017, when Harvard said that it was going to do research after that, what they did was that they hired me. They hired one person as a postdoc to work on this project. I was not given resources that I needed. I was not given contacts with people who could help me. I was not given any of the support to actually do that work. And it was just a way of saying, so every time you've read in the last 2 years that Harvard is doing the work, they've been talking about one person in a basement who doesn't have the support that they need or the contacts that they need. And so they're getting a lot of credit for doing work that they haven't actually been doing. And the last thing is insular, which is that Harvard is very committed so far, and maybe this will change, but they're so far committed to talking about themselves to themselves. And so instead of something like inviting Ms. Lanier to be a decision maker and a person who can help steer the committee and set the committee's priorities and those sorts of things, as other universities have done, inviting in descendant communities as experts, not as people to receive knowledge from Harvard, but as experts who should be setting the priorities and the goals of that committee. Harvard is studying itself, and it's investing in itself, and it's putting aside money to continue to invest in itself rather than reaching out and finding knowledge and priorities and just from descendant communities that exist and from descendant communities that have already been making demands of Harvard. So not just Ms. Lanier, but the government of Antigua and other people who have already contacted Harvard and said, we need to be part of this. Harvard has pushed them aside. And so that's the insularity of this project that Harvard wants to keep just to define the terms of debate, to define what counts as a source, to define what counts as an outcome, and not have that input from other people.
Thank you to you both. I want to play very quickly a short video excerpt from the 2017 conference that both of you referenced, and then afterwards I have a question, especially for Ms. Lanier and her daughter Shanrell. So I'm going to go into share screen mode. This is again the 2017 conference that was hosted at Radcliffe Universities and Slavery, and this is in the opening of that conference where the then Dean of Radcliffe, Elizabeth Cohen, is giving opening remarks.
His career. The image of Renty that you see on the cover of your program and here on the screen is one of those images. To Agassi, Renty was a specimen to inform the Harvard teaching curriculum and to contribute to the development of the academic disciplines of comparative anatomy and anthropology. Renty's catalogued biological characteristics were what interested Agassi. Today, it is Renty's personal story that interests us. So what do we know about that story? The historical record tells us that Renty was a member of the Congo tribe. The historical record tells us that he spent his days laboring. The historical record tells us that he was a father. His daughter Delia also worked on the Edge Hill plantation. Renty was surely much more than either Agassi's list of characteristics or the bare facts revealed in the conventional written historical record. Much of his personal story remains unknown or pieced together by conjecture because so much has been erased from that written record.
Conjecture, pieced together by conjecture. To Ms. Lanier and also to Shanrell, you were present at this conference, again, as you stated, without sort of like against the university's wishes. How do you respond to that? And can you talk about the oral histories that your family has done throughout the generations to keep Renty's and Delia's story alive?
Shanrell, are you there? I
Oh, I
wanted
was
to.
muted. Sorry, I was muted. Despite my mute, you could probably visibly have seen my eye roll. Like I can tell you that personally, I think that that entire incident will be one of the things that upsets me the most out of this. For us to walk in there, for them to know that we were there, and to stand in front of us and tell us that our stories were invalid, and to minimize our family history to conjecture, and to state that they were at all interested in Renty's personal history. Meanwhile, they had gone years of actively ignoring us and trying to deflect and redirect and re-script narratives around our great-great-great-grandfather is insane. But I think it speaks to that idea that Black stories and Black lives and Black bodies don't bear the same weight or importance to Harvard or institutions like that, who are still, piecing together these little paltry attempts to claim their history, to acknowledge their connections to slavery. I think it was ultimately very insulting.
Yeah. What that is, it was apparent to me early on that Harvard had a narrative, that irrespective of what were to come up or show up or be substantiated or proven, Harvard was not going to deviate from that narrative. They have decided that they are going to tell Renty's story, Renty's truth, and that they are going to create a narrative irrespective of things that are documented, things that are a part of official records that substantiate our story. And I say that because early on, when I wrote to Drew Faust, I believe in 2010 or 11, I said, I'm troubled to understand. True lovers of history would be amazed by this story. Think of the importance of a factual document, or think of the importance of Louis Agassiz's scientific racism, using subjects to promote the rationale that Blacks were a separate and lesser species. I said, but the irony of the fact that the subjects he knew were literate people, intelligent people. I pointed out that, Renty, for the person he was, actually turns this science on its head. It's an amazing irony. Why aren't you interested? And when I would reach out specifically with questions, I get non-responsive responses. When I would speak to reporters throughout the years, I only had 1 month, that's the month of February, to promote this story and to put it in the public domain. During Black History Month, I would reach out to reporters to tell this story. And I had difficulty breaking that glass ceiling because Harvard would discount, knowing that my statements and my documents were factual, they would discount my story to the press. I have emails from people who said, based on the response from Harvard, I'm sorry, but we're not going to run the story. I have an email from a reporter or an editor with the Crimson who said, based on the response from the Peabody, I apologize. After I had traveled to Massachusetts, I had spent the day there meeting with reporters, but the Peabody shut that story down. And so this has always been my experience with them. And so, I learned early on that they were going to control the narrative, and they were not going to consider the information about who Renty was. And what hurts for me is my motivation. What drives me is not only who this man was, but what he was to my mother. This is how this journey all began. And it starts with an oral history, from the man in that image to his children, to his grandchildren, to his great-grandchildren, to my mother, to me. That's how important this man was to his family. 5 generations later, 6 generations later, we're still talking about that Black African Papa Renty because he was that larger than life person. And he did things despite his own peril to build people up. He was a community person. He was a religious person. He taught people from the Bible. He taught people to read. And these are the oral history and those stories of who this man was. And if you had ever met my mother, or if you had ever heard her on her deathbed, my mother is talking about this man. Days before she died, she was talking about her elders. This was so very important to her. Renty was so very important to her. And when they deny him his identity, his legacy, it's an affront to my family. It's an affront to my mother. I think it's an affront to all Black families, because the other interesting aspect of the race science that Harvard promoted and promulgated was that it was the destruction of Black families. So Harvard, even though, you know, we're talking 180 years later, they're still attacking Black families and marginalizing not only Renty, but in a whole, it's a marginalizing of Black life when they deny him his legacy, when they know that there are documents that support what I'm saying.
Absolutely. And just to a step forward and complete agreement with what my mother said, but the fact of the matter is at that conference on that day, Harvard knew who we were. They knew who Renty was. They knew that we were in the audience. They knew. And so to stand in front of those people and to say that according to the historical record, well, what historical record are you speaking to? The one that we've documented? Are you saying that our historical record doesn't matter? And once you have invalidated our history, what future do you have? If you have nothing, no bearings on where you came from, no understanding of your roots, where do you go from there? And I think that strategically, if you do that, if you say that your stories are not enough, is what Harvard is essentially telling my family, that your stories do not matter. Your record is not enough. We know that the United States of America did not care about us, from the way that they recorded us in the census. They recorded our births, our deaths. It's very extremely hard to find. And I mean, I remember that we went to a conference at a local place out here, the Hempstead House. And one of the questions that came from the audience after telling our story was, well, this is less than 200 years. Well, what's so miraculous about you being able to go back a handful of generations? Why is this story so important? And I think that it speaks to the fact, do you understand how hard it is to get that information? There are still dead ends to our family tree that we will never be able to find because nobody other than us cared about us back then. So nobody cared enough to record their life or their death. And the reason why we have as much information on Renty is because it was connected to his owner's lives. He was probated. Like, could you imagine sitting there and looking at a document that proves that your ancestor was willed to the next person? Like that, and that's the only record that you have of their movements, is to be able to track them through someone else's will, where they're listed right next to the cattle and the buckets of wheat and crops. So what historical record is Harvard talking about? Because I mean, we were able to find something, and that was glorious and God sent in itself. But what historical record is she speaking to? It's obviously not the one that is out for the public, that involves the same information that's been validated over and over again by genealogists and historians. So Harvard must have access to their own history, or as my mother said, they are determined to carry out this narrative, that they are some type of great white hope for the Black families, and that they are the great controllers of our history and thusly our futures and our lives.
Thank you all for your responses to that question. I want to, at this time, ask if anyone who's watching, if you want to have a question for our panel, you can send those to me directly in the chat. I have one question, well, I have several more questions, but I'm going to choose this one because I think it ties together the different threads that you all have mentioned. So in 2019, organizers with the Harvard Prison Divestment Campaign asked Harvard President Larry Bacow about the daguerreotypes of Renty and Delia. He responded, quote, "Those images belong to history," end quote. Harvard historian, professor, and TV host Henry Louis Gates Jr. wrote in a foreword to the book, To Make a War of Their Own, the Zealy daguerreotypes. He wrote in that foreword, "Can any one person be the heir to these photographs? Or does the responsibility for them fall to us all to protect them as archival relics of history, to be studied, pondered, and reckoned with," end quote. How do you respond to President Bacow and Henry Louis Gates, who host, by the way, a very popular show in genealogy?
I will start when and Henry Gates also participated in this most recent book. He wrote a foreword where he said virtually those same things. And when I learned of that, immediately I went to that infamous beer summit that he had with President Obama and a Cambridge police, I believe a sergeant. And so I immediately thought, okay, here is a man who, when his rights were trampled on, engaged in such self-righteous indignation, and rightfully so, because he felt his rights were being compromised. He was the victim of racial profiling. He was indignant and he was inconsolable, and he was going to challenge and champion this cause all the way to the end. So why is it when it comes to my family's heirloom, my family's rights, we should concede and say, okay, let the world be the keepers of these images? He wouldn't have conceded, and I don't believe he would concede if he ever felt his rights were being trampled on. And for President Bacow, you know, he has made a number of missteps, in my view, that speaks to not only his character, but how he views Black bodies. He made some inappropriate comments around fundraising and linking that to, you know, and at a time when this country is so polarized by race, to make such an insensitive comment. He also made a comment saying that we are the ethical stewards of these images. There is nothing ethical about what Harvard University has done in these images. And to say that, you know, these images belong to history, you know, I'm reminded of the African proverb, and help me out if I misquote this, but until the lions have their historian, the glory of the hunt will always be told by the hunter. And so, Bethel, you're not telling my family history. You don't own the rights to my family history. You don't own the rights to my story. You don't own the rights to Renty's story. And that's the privilege that we all talk about, to suggest, to be comfortable enough to assert that, tells me that he devalues not only Renty's life, but the legacy that his story carries. And so, you know, I can only say this, neither one of those gentlemen have any credibility in my mind based on the history and based on the things that they have said.
I agree with that. And, you know, when you read those quotations from President Bacow and Professor Gates, they, it sounds exactly like what's happening in conversations about, you know, the Parthenon marbles or the Benin bronzes in you know, the British Museum, where people are asking for their looted possessions back, and the British Museum says, well, we have to keep them safe, we have to keep them for history, you know, that whole argument. And I think that what Harvard and President Bacow in particular doesn't doesn't understand or doesn't choose to understand is that Miss Lanier's claim is not a one-off single claim that's disconnected from everything else. They want to treat it as a single thing that they can delay, they can fight this one thing, and they are not thinking about the larger decolonial movement that is coming for them and all of their museums and all of their collections, and that they need to have a strategy, because it's not just about a small number of daguerreotypes, because Agassiz took a whole lot of pictures and not just those, but it's about a lot of the collections and about the whole movement, a global movement of decolonization that is coming for this issue. And it's not just these, I mean, I don't mean to invalidate the importance of these daguerreotypes in your fight, absolutely, but they want it to be a small piece, and it's a big piece. This is connected to prison divestment. This is connected to a whole range of issues. And in my experience as being the person who was doing the research on this, I found that President Bacow was not interested in any of this. I was never able to get a meeting with him, except one time when I ambushed him in the archives, and I was never able to get a formal meeting with him. He didn't seem interested in this topic. I know that he's announced that he's funding this committee at Radcliffe and gets a lot of credit for that, but I did not find him to be interested in these issues or curious about them at all.
Dr. Hopkins, I have a follow-up for you on the point of the museum. So the daguerreotypes of Delia, Renty, and others enslaved on that plantation in South Carolina, as well as daguerreotypes of people in Brazil, are held captive at the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology. Dr. Hopkins, can you give us more context on that museum in terms of what it and other Harvard repositories collect?
Sure. And I should say just at the beginning that the work that I did for Harvard was a proprietary report, meaning that it's owned by Harvard. So nothing I'm going to say today is anything that's particular to that report. I'll only talk about things that are published elsewhere. So if you want references to published work, please let me know and I can provide that for you. So the Peabody Museum was founded in the 1860s as a museum of archaeology and ethnology to collect objects from primitive, savage, barbaric, these are 19th century words, cultures, all in one place. And the first curator was a guy named Jeffries Wyman. Jeffries Wyman was a doctor. He was a Harvard undergrad, but then he went away and was a professor of medicine at a medical school in Virginia before he came back to Harvard. And one of the things that Jeffries Wyman was really interested in was comparative anatomy. This was a time when the medical faculty and the anthropology faculty worked very closely together. And so Jeffries Wyman, the first curator of the Peabody Museum, was a doctor and was interested in dissecting people, and especially interested in the bodies of enslaved people. There's a book called The Price of Their Pound of Flesh by Dana Ramey Berry, where she talks about Jeffries Wyman and his business when he lived in Virginia, when he supplied the corpses of enslaved people to northern medical schools for dissection. That was his business. And here at Harvard, he continued that. There was an incident in the 1860s where there was a zoological exhibit of 5 men from Africa who were brought to Boston and put in a zoo for exhibit. And during the exhibit, which ran for several months, the youngest man, a guy named Sturmajanchis, who was 17 years old, hanged himself. And the zoo gave his body to Jeffries Wyman for public dissection, turned his skeleton into a teaching tool, and took plaster casts of his face for possibly scholarly reasons, but we don't really know why he took the plaster casts. There's a really great senior thesis from a Harvard undergrad that won a Hoops Prize about this incident in 2011. So I can send that to you if you want. But so the Peabody Museum now has these casts of this teenage boy's face. These are the kinds of things that are in the Peabody Museum. And the Peabody Museum is just one of Harvard's many museums, archives, and libraries, and many of them hold other things like that. And I don't tell that story to be sensational or provocative, but just that is one example of many, many, many things that are in Harvard's collections.
And Jared, if I could add and build on that, for years I have pondered over why Harvard has reacted in the way that it has to me in my story. And, you know, I would ask myself, what is it? It must be something awful big, awful important for them to engage in this kind of reckless academic scholarship. And so, you know, after there was a piece that I read that kind of made everything, you know, laid everything plain for me. And that was basically to build off what Caitlin is saying. And there's precedent for this. But when you think about, again, universities, when you think about American museums, who all have appropriated work, and particularly when it's relative to Afro-American culture or cultural property, there's a large segment of our population that don't believe there are relics of slavery or that there are cultural property that is associated with slavery. And so to have not only property like Renty and Delia in their image, but also property of value is uniquely unique in that, as my daughter kind of alluded to earlier, what it takes to definitively link yourselves to enslaved people, and the challenges that you face doing that. But then to have a descendant show up and say, you know, you have exploited my ancestors, you have acquired their property through the force and violence of slavery, and you don't have the right to own it, and we want it repatriated back to the family. This opens a door. It actually opens a Pandora's box that I think not only museums and universities, but all over the world would rather stay closed, because the enormous wealth associated with these cultural relics and the transference of property is probably immeasurable. So I think Harvard has resisted and fought tooth and nail because of the concern of what might be if they were to have to repatriate or return a relic such as these daguerreotypes, and what kind of Pandora's box would that open for them? And I say that when I said earlier that there's precedence, I often link my story to the experience of a Holocaust survivor, a woman by the name of Maria Altman, who fled Austria and came to the United States during the Holocaust era. And when she arrived, she found that her aunt, an image of her aunt, was being hailed as the Mona Lisa of Austria. And it was a portrait that was done, a painting that was done by, that was done for her aunt, Adele Blackbauer. But at any rate, she fought, just like I'm fighting, to recover the image of her aunt. And she fought the Austrian government to no avail. And actually, the Belvedere where the image was being held, that curator said, the law is on our side. Just like President Bacow said in one of his famous quotes, that the law is on their side. But it turns out that the moral law was not, and not only that, but the legal law. And Maria Altman actually fought and was victorious here in the United States and recovered the image of her aunt. But after that, what our country did to say that this should never happen again and to protect the relics of the Holocaust, there was a Washington conference that was held in DC, I think around 2015.
2016, you're talking the reuniting victims with their lost heritage.
The conference was held before then, where they bring people from all over the world to look at historically what happened and to set in place measures so that this will never happen again. And out of that conference came the HERE Act, which was legislation that said museums, you canvass your property. If you find relics of the Holocaust, you do everything you can to return those images to the family. It's the morally right thing to do, and it absolutely is. But my question is, where are those same protections for relics of slavery and descendants of American slaves? And so it's an irony that, you know, firstly frustrates me because we are still fighting HR 40. And Congressman John Conyers, I want to say probably 30 years ago, said, can we at least have a discussion about reparations and slavery? And it is no way, no way, no way. And I look at what is done for other aggrieved groups, and I'm like, where is the equal protection? And specifically in my case, Adele Blackbauer received justice. Delia did not. And so when we frame this larger conversation about reparations, and you hear lawmakers and you hear people saying, oh, it's too broad, it's too encompassing, we have precedent. We have been here before. We have done this before. And so, but it's just, again, the devaluing of Black life, the failure to acknowledge the Black Holocaust, and in its failure, in this country's failure to even appropriately apologize. It's, you know, we talk about disinheritance, or I often talk about disinheritance, and the fact that our constitutional protections in the 13th and the 14th Amendment, we need to start speaking honestly about they have never lived up to their expectations. And this country has never lived up to its obligations to appropriately address slavery, the relics of slavery, and having the discussion about how to repair the harm.
Exactly. And I just, one thing, and I know, Jared, I just saw your finger, and Mom, you just said it, and I had pulled it up, that quote from the HERE Act where it said, decades and generations overdue, Congress can provide some measures of peace and justice to the families whose cherished art was brazenly stolen by the Nazis, Blumenthal said. This is the time is well past to return the ill-gotten gains of the long ago horror. Financial recovery can never compensate for the unspeakable inhumanity and tragedy of the Holocaust, but it helps recognize at least the courage and strength of the survivors.
That's so offensive because it is race-based. Because if I were, that legislation protects the victims of the Holocaust. And again, this is a necessary measure because we have to, as a country, repair the harm caused to any aggrieved group. But you cannot get any, and this was unanimously supported, and it was signed into law in 2016 or 17 by President Obama. Today, these same senators are not willing to look at the parallels in this story. And if there was a vote today, neither one of them would vote for it. And that's race-based.
I wanted to ask you one quick question, and then we'll take a break and transition into part 2 of the convening. So Ms. Lanier and to Shanrell, what can attendees at this event, people who are watching on the live stream, what can they do to support your effort to get Harvard to return the images of Renty and Delia?
I can tell you, my grandmother had this old saying that she would drill into our heads all the time. She would say, tell the truth and shame the devil. Okay? Tell the truth and shame Harvard. Okay? There's no way that this is just this is not just a Black story. This is not just an African-American story. This is not just our story. This is America's story, and we need to make sure that they're held accountable to being honest and true and transparent in their dealings with this case so that they can be held to that same standard the next time it comes around. You know, Harvard has maintained this narrative that there's no history here. There's nothing to be found here. There's nothing to see here. You know, whatever they can do to deny and deflect away from owning the fact that, yes, they participated in this pseudoscience research, that, yes, they had ties to wanting to continue American slavery, that they invested efforts to do so in this research journey that they put Agizi onto, and shame them, though. Call them out at every turn. Harvard should not get one moment of peace. You can call, you can email. I think that we have true moral ground. Absolutely. The legal ground stuff, we leave that to the attorneys. But Harvard needs to know they're wrong and be held to the fire to do what's right.
Yeah, I would say that, she took the words out of my mouth. And I have, when I've been asked in the past, is encourage people to share this story. Tell our truth. Help us get this story out. Because historically, Harvard has so successfully blocked us from sharing the story. And I also want to add, with respect to the book, because the book is also perpetrating these same false narratives. And there's one section in there where I read about the wild speculation. That's the only thing that I can refer to it as. And Jared, I had an image I sent you of my family tree. If you can share that so that I could share with people that in my family, there have been 5 generations of renting named after the man in that image. I refer to them as Renty 1, Renty 2, Renty 3, Renty 4, and my mother's brother was actually the last Renty. He's Renty 5. But the research that the Harvard has hired people, I think, just to find an alternative theory of my case, an alternative theory of my research. But what he did was, he went on wild speculation about what happened to Renty, Delia, and Jack. But the Renty that he was referring to is the man that I refer to as Renty number 2. And that is clearly outlined in the documents. And it's frustrating because he also says that there aren't multiple Renties on the will, which clearly, if you look at the document, you see multiple Renties. He talks about the fact, there's the family tree there. And he also talks about the fact, and I have that document as well. Jared, if you could show them the Thomas Taylor slave index.
1 second, that's in a different window. And I should also point out that we are going to have to wrap up in about 2 minutes max, because we have a student who's presenting class.
Well, you would rather students ask questions, but these things that he speaks on so affirmatively are directly inconsistent with the documents. And he knows this at the time. He can't say he was unaware, because in February of 2019, prior to the New York Times article, a reporter pointed it out to him. And he was quoted in the New York Times article. And he talks about the slaves being in family groupings. There's a big Renty here, and then there's Renty and other children. And, I said, well, when you see big Renty, that is because there's a little Renty. And historically in Black families, that means that there is a child named Renty after the father. And he didn't agree with that. But in Benjamin Franklin Taylor's will, he connects these 2 families that the Harvard genealogist or English teacher genealogist said are 2 separate independent families. So, the book fails in so many areas. There are too many to talk about in one setting, but it's important that people take everything that Harvard says with a grain of salt and do your own research to confirm or dispute that, because, they're entitled to their opinion, but not the facts. And so.
Right. And you can find us on Facebook at Free Renty, on Twitter as well. There is the Harvard Coalition to Free Renty website if you want more details on any actionable things that you can do to help us in demanding that Harvard free Papa Renty.
Thank you all so much, Tamara Lanier, Chanrel Lanier, Caitlin Hopkins, for your time. That's a great segue into part two, where we're going to hear from students who are doing research and organizing around the presence and past of slavery at Harvard. We're going to take a brief, like 30-second, 1-minute interlude while we set up. And we'll see you in about a minute or so. Thank you again to all of the panelists.
Hello, everyone. How are you? My name is Mary McNeil. I am a PhD candidate in American Studies at Harvard, working broadly on questions about Black and Native geographies of the Northeast and social movements. And I'd just like to thank you all for being with us, for holding space with us, for listening to Ms. Lanier and both Ms. Laniers and Dr. Hopkins and all of our student panelists. I've learned a lot from this event. It is my honor and my privilege to be in dialogue today with this panel of organizers. I'm really in awe of the work that they have done over the years because they've taken up scholar Saidiya Hartman's assertion that care is the antidote to violence in their work around the life and afterlives of slavery at Harvard. In my opinion, their organizing is an adherence with Ruha Benjamin's assertion that we must cultivate a practice of kinfulness that both cares for the dead and for those who gendered racial capitalism and the carceral state seeks to render as materially dead, although spiritually alive. In calling for redress, these organizers shed light upon the depth of the university's investments in slavery and its afterlives, and the broad terrain that such investments cover, from Massachusetts to the Carolinas, to Antigua, to Brazil, to West Africa, and beyond. So before we begin our conversation, however, I'd like to introduce our panelists. I will ask them a couple of questions, we'll have a moderated conversation, and then we'll open it up to Q&A from the audience. If you have a question for our panelists, please feel free to privately message me your questions in the chat function, and I will try to aggregate the questions as best as possible. So now on to our esteemed panelists. Rena Karifa Johnson is the Director of Campaigns and Advocacy for the SE Justice Group, a nonprofit organization of women with incarcerated loved ones taking on the rampant injustices created by mass incarceration. Rena is a graduate of Harvard Law School, and while enrolled, she was an organizer for Belinda Hall, the student collective that successfully pressured Harvard Law School to retire the royal family seal. Azani Creeks is a first-year student at Harvard Divinity School, where she is pursuing a Master of Theological Studies degree with a focus in African and African American religious studies. Before starting at HDS, Azani worked in strategic research for a labor union in DC, where she is currently located. As an undergraduate at USC in Los Angeles, Azani organized with community members and other students on campus to hold USC accountable for its participation in gentrification, workers' rights abuses, and the legacy of slavery. And she looks forward to continuing this work at Harvard. Christelle Olukoy is an organizer at Harvard Prison Divestment Campaign, as well as Mwasi, a French Afro-feminist militant group. She is also a PhD student at Harvard in African and African American Studies, where she is researching nightlife, policing, and the afterlives of colonial imaginations in Lagos. And last but not least, Samantha O'Sullivan is a junior at Harvard College, currently at home in DC, concentrating in physics and African American Studies. Samantha is the co-founder and president of the Harvard Generational African American Students Association, or GASA for short, which works to build community amongst Black students descended from the enslaved and raise awareness of social injustice related to the heinous legacy of slavery. Samantha is also a student leader in the Student Coalition to Free Renty, and recently moderated a panel with Ms. Lanier, Attorney Ben Crump, Preston Tisdale, and George Clinton. She hopes to represent the undergraduate student voice on our panel today in pressuring Harvard administration for change. So please welcome our panelists. All right, y'all. So before, why don't we just kind of jump right into it? I'd like to start off with a kind of a twofold question. So my first question for the group, and y'all can sort of answer in any way, any format, any order that feels comfortable to you. But can you just sort of begin by introducing what your group is, what your group does, and how your group's work intersects with conversation on Harvard's complicity in slavery or its afterlives?
I guess I can begin. So, hi, as you so nicely put in my bio, my name is Samantha. I'm a junior and undergraduate at the college. And so the group that I'm the president of, Harvard GASA, we really work to raise awareness of issues that relate to undergrads at the college relating to the legacy of slavery. So some of the issues that we've addressed include building names. So I know the project earlier talked about Mather House, also the Agassiz Welcome Center. We've hosted a lot of dialogues among students about what's the power of names and their effects. And specifically related to the free Renty issue, we've worked alongside a lot of the wonderful people on this call. Meredith has been an especially great student leader as well, to raise awareness amongst the student body of the daguerreotypes and the fact that Harvard is intentionally concealing them from the student body and intentionally concealing their history. Before last spring, I had no knowledge that Harvard owned these daguerreotypes, and we have really worked hard to raise awareness amongst the student body and circulate petitions and invite students to submit video letters to President McCow to pressure the administration to return these images to Ms. Lanier. As mentioned earlier, we hosted a webinar a few weeks ago with attorney Ben Crump, where he sort of put all of this in the national light of Black Lives Matter, because, essentially ownership and issues of who owns the right to Black images and Black bodies perfectly ties into the national conversation around Black Lives Matter today. So that's a little bit about our group and what we've done.
Hi everyone, you'll have to forgive me. Like 10 minutes before I got on the Zoom, my husband dropped a drill into his foot and had to go to urgent care. And he was supposed to be watching the baby. So me and my son are in the Zoom. Hopefully he behaves himself. But my name is Rena Karifa Johnson. Thank you so much for having me here. I love getting together with people who are trying to drag Harvard, because there's no shortage of amount that it needs to be dragged. I went to the law school. I graduated in 2016. I was part of, as Mary said, Reclaim Harvard Law, which became Belinda Hall, which was a group of students organizing, like, largely to dismantle the institution, but it started as a response to kind of Harvard inaction and deep complicity in an anti-Black oppressive legal structure that results in the death of countless Black bodies. And I happened to be at school the year my friend was murdered. And I think the kind of external organizing became internal organizing. And it started as like, yeah, Harvard's liberal, like, we're gonna stop this. And then we started looking around and we're like, you guys are all with it. Like, why are you looking at us? Like, we're saying some wild things. So what became a critique of the world became a critique of the institution, which made very clear to us the ways in which Harvard as an institution is like foundational in perpetuating hierarchies in the world and creating them and justifying them and obfuscating their kind of sinister nature. So that's what we were doing. How and why was it connected to slavery? I think a lot of our projects became about kind of like political education, and in politically educating ourselves, we became very aware of the role that Harvard played in kind of perpetuating and upholding slavery. The law school is basically like a shrine to slavery. The shield was from Isaac Royal, who was like an Antiguan slaver. That was like the way that we moved through the world and expressed ourselves in the world. If you go into the library, there's like a huge portrait of Justice Taney, who was the justice who wrote the Dred Scott decision, followed by a little quote from Scalia, who was like, dang, what a great man. And his whole illustrious career was overshadowed by how people felt about that little Dred Scott decision. There's Pound Hall. There's just like in every single way, the architecture of the school is about like glorifying racial capitalism, glorifying slavery, glorifying oppression. So our movement was called Belinda Hall because it was named after a woman who changed her name from Belinda Royal to Belinda Sutton, who was enslaved by Isaac Royal, who's the man who donated the money to Harvard to have their first legal chair, which became the law school. So he paid for the founding of the law school. And he lived in Massachusetts that had huge plantations in Antigua. And Belinda Royal was enslaved by him. She was freed eventually, and she sued his family in the state of Massachusetts to basically receive reparations, to receive like a pension for the rest of the life for her labor that she had done during that time, and changed her name to Belinda Sutton. So our movement, which became kind of like a 6-month occupation of the student lounge and kind of an independent institution, I think what became as a movement to try to integrate ourselves into the institution and make the institution more just, became very inspired by like the concept of marooning. And we were just like, okay, like why would we ask you to teach us these things? You don't even know these things. So we're gonna like create an institution for ourselves. And the student lounge was called Belinda Hall, and our movement was called Belinda Hall. And the two things that we won were the shield being removed. I don't know if they've ever replaced it. I do think that that is significant. I'm not trying to say that symbols don't matter, but like we wanted a critical race studies department. Like we wanted money to go to Antigua. We wanted the law school to be free. Like we wanted a lot more than the shield being changed. But that was a big win, and that was obviously related to Harvard's relationship to slavery. And I think in a very telling move, we asked for like a monument to Belinda, and they gave us literally a rock. There's a rock in front of the law school with like a plaque that is this big that has Belinda Sutton's name on it. And that's kind of what they were taking their victory lap around, and that was kind of their way of addressing slavery meaningfully at the school.
Thank you, Rena. Anybody from HPDC want to talk a little bit about HPDC work?
Yes, I can talk about that. Hi, everyone. HPDC, the Harvard Prison Divestment Campaign, is a student-led campaign with input and accountability mechanisms towards incarcerated folks, which is centered on Harvard's relation to the prison industrial complex. And we consider that these relations as one of the concrete manifestations of the afterlives of slavery and Harvard's continued role in the destruction of Black families. So just quickly, the prison industrial complex is the very symbiotic relationship between public, private, and public and private capital, and also forms of carcerality. And it impacts disproportionately Black people. And at Harvard specifically, and in universities in general, it manifests itself in the endowment and how Harvard invests in companies that profit from prisons and incarcerations in all their many forms. So the main goal of HPDC is to sever this relationship, and it's oriented around 3 objectives, which are disclosing the endowment, because at the moment, Harvard's endowment is very opaque. Only 1% is public, and all of the rest is private. The second axis is divesting from companies that profit from the prison industrial complex. And the third axis is transforming, which would mean reinvesting in communities that have been affected by the prison industrial complex, but also by Harvard's anti-Blackness in general. So in Boston, for instance, it's also communities that have been gentrified by this institution. So HPDC works through many channels, mostly sensibilization and disruption of events. But also there is currently a lawsuit against Harvard, which my fellow organizer Azani will talk a bit more about. And there is also a research component where we're trying to prove Harvard's ties to the prison industrial complex, because the institution, of course, denies that it is investing in it. Our latest updated numbers prove that Harvard was investing 11 million in prisons still. And this is only for the public aspect of the endowment.
So thank you all so much for just sharing a little bit about all of the different projects that you all are doing or have done in relation to Harvard and its complicity in slavery or slavery's afterlives. Harvard is so decentralized, and so I really appreciate just having the opportunity to have all of y'all amazing speakers in a room talking about the work that you're doing in your own pockets, your own schools, and building coalitions across the university. My next question is a little bit of an open-ended question, a heartfelt question, but I'd really love to hear just a little bit more about what brought you to this work. What was it that sort of brought you to this work? What motivates you or motivated you to do this? Be it, trying to reimagine institutions, thinking about the power of naming, pressuring the university to divest from the prison industrial complex. What motivates this work or drives you as an organizer?
I can speak to that and my journey to abolition. I think what brings me to this work every day is just being a Black woman in America and being wholly and deeply unsatisfied with the range of options that we're presented with for how to end racism or whatever. And when I say range of options, I don't really mean that we have a lot of options. They're like, please vote, please call your congresspeople, maybe peacefully protest in a certain specific way. And I first read Are Prisons Obsolete in 2018, and my answer was a resounding yes. And I feel like abolition was the first thing that offered me some hope and like something new. I was a history major in undergrad, so I'm always like thinking with my historian cap on, and I'm like, I'm really tired of trying the same things that have been tried over and over. And I think that abolition asks the right questions. It asks new questions about how can we end harm rather than how can we end crime? What does true safety look like? How can we build communities that are equipped to care for one another and well-resourced? And I think abolition is the best strategy and goal to find answers to those questions. And so I think like, I also don't have like an incarcerated loved one or any kind of like deep personal history that ties me to the work of abolition. But like I encourage people who also maybe like don't have that personal tie to get involved too, because it's so much bigger than like things that we see on TV about prison. Like it's a big system, and doing this work helps me learn more about it, but also helps me imagine different futures.
I would say that for me, what really motivated me to found GASA as an organization and get so involved with the Coalition to Free Renty is I have a very deep personal interest in ancestry and genealogy. And I think I always think of, myself having the fortunate position of being able to attend Harvard and get the education I do is all on the backs of my enslaved ancestors. And in doing a lot of this activism and work, I think issues like these are often seen as Black issues, or slavery is seen as a Black issue. And I think a lot of white people and non-white people like to distance themselves from it and say, oh, my ancestors weren't slave owners and things like that. But we're all here because of slavery. This country was built by slavery. And as we've discussed today, every part of all of our institutions, especially Harvard, are built on the backs of slavery. And so I think that we all have a special responsibility to speak for our enslaved ancestors who were denied a voice. I think especially with the Coalition to Free Renty, here we have immortalized this picture of a man and his daughter and several other individuals who were literally forced to stand naked for a picture. And the fact that picture is being circulated and held by Harvard, it's an atrocity, and it's something that we have a responsibility to use our voices as students and to use our voices as people with education that, again, our ancestors were denied. So it's sort of all of those factors that really motivate me to this work.
Similar to Adani and Samantha, I would say just being a Black woman in the world in the wake of slavery and its afterlives, but to Harvard and slavery more specifically, I think this is like the kind of violence this institution brings to Black communities and beyond is like, it's very difficult not to see it every day, everywhere, and not to be enraged every day. And I'm a student in the African and African American Studies department and the anthropology department. And both departments have kind of aggravated the harm that has been done to Miss Lanier. And both have contributed to the recirculations of those images. And I remember like one of my first days entering the anthro department, which is related to the Peabody Museum. Our classes were taking place in a classroom where images similar to that of Renty and Delia were exposed. And all of the faculty behaved like it was normal. Like many students were like, what's happening? And we were just faced with like a lot of gaslighting and the idea that these were like testaments to history and they had to be exposed in that way so that we would not forget that history. As if as Black students, we can forget that history, and as if that's the best way to actually honor and like be accountable to that history. So I guess HPDC for me was a way to deal with those legacies of slavery at Harvard, but also the very material and concrete ways in which Harvard continue to inflict violence to descendants of enslaved people.
Yeah, thank you everybody so much for sharing. It's hard for me to answer that question because I think it's there was so many things. Like I give humongous credit to like the movement for Black Lives. I give humongous credit to the people of Ferguson who were just like, fuck this, excuse my language, but like we're in the streets and like really making very clear and like not dramatizing and being dramatic, but like dramatizing by risking their own bodies, like the stakes of this fight every single day for Black people. I think a big part of it, yeah, so I give like a lot of credit to the folks who stood up in the streets. I don't think I would be doing what I'm doing today if not for Mike Brown or Ayanna Jones or Sandra Bland or all of the Black people who were murdered and who led me to a disillusionment with any kind of like institutional fix. I also think that Harvard felt unique to me in the level of complicity and gaslighting, like Christelle was talking about. I felt like as a Black girl who had been in a lot of white institutions my whole life, part of why I was okay with, like when I came to Harvard, I was like, I don't want to work in the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, was just because like I got by okay. Like people would say racist things, problematic things would happen. But I felt like when I got to Harvard, it was like the first time uniquely that I felt the design of an institution trying to like psychologically manipulate me to like either forsake my people or to just like be cast as dumb, or I couldn't think like a lawyer, or I'm not a good critical thinker, or I'm not a good problem solver, I'm just divisive. So I think that was a big part of it to me, the law school experience and kind of the way that you begin to recognize like what thinking like a lawyer means. It often just means not bringing any type of moral arguments or any of your own idiosyncratic, ancestral, or cultural knowledge into the space, and really just thinking like the system thinks to like justify what the system is doing. So I think all of those things together is what led me to start organizing at Harvard. And I think that what had me continue is like, once you see it, you can't unsee it. Like, so it's the same way the law school is designed to bring us to a certain conclusion. Like the carceral state is designed to kill Black people and then obscure its own violence. And I think that once you see that all of these things are happening by design, how can you not kind of try to organize to dismantle it?
100%. Thank you all so much for sharing your thoughts and your feelings on that and what really drives you to this work. Thank you for centering the fact that, our, embodied experiences moving through the world every day, that's a source of knowledge that needs to be centered in imagining another world and asserting that another world is possible. We are running really, really short on time, so I'm gonna stop asking you the questions that I've drawn up and actually turn it over to audience questions, because there's a lot of intersections, I think, in questions I was sort of interested in hearing y'all talk about more, and some questions from the audience. The first question that I would love, if y'all have any insights on, is what do you think is sort of the role of white and non-Black people in organizing, specifically on campuses around issues pertaining to slavery and its afterlives? The person who asked this question asked it particularly with the sort of thought in mind of what is the role of white and non-Black people in disrupting what oftentimes happens on campuses, where Blackness becomes something sort of quantified and studied, as opposed to, we're trying to do work that's going to get people a little bit more free. So that's one question. I'm just going to ask the two other questions, and y'all can sort of pick and choose. The second question in the chat is a question about what are the strategies and tactics that have worked best for your organization or your group, and what are strategies and tactics that you don't think necessarily work well in the context of organizing on college campuses. And then the last question that we have is a question about wellness. How do y'all stay well or try to stay well while doing this work, given the sort of immense emotional toll that, trying to sort of address institutional violence can sort of have on our bodies, on our psyches, on our spirits, in addition to all of the rest of the mess that's going on in the world. So those would be my three questions, and y'all can feel free to sort of pick 1, 2, 3, all, none.
I will just quickly say, like, one thing that was amazing, like, my experience at Harvard really radicalized me. It really changed my life. If you'll see in the back there, I have like Belinda memorabilia in my office, but it's because I think that you recognize, like, once you organize one thing, you've organized everything. That's not to say that, like, the level of sacrifice is much bigger or smaller, the stakes are different, but like the playbook is very much the same. And when I read Blood in the Water about the Attica Uprising by Heather Thompson, I was just like, yo, the prison administrators there did like every single thing other than like the highest escalation, they didn't murder us, that like the law school administrators did here. So what I will say is that, like, Nothing that happens behind closed doors is useful to you. No meeting behind closed doors with the dean is useful to you. If you hear about like a working group or a study or a commission, run. Like, that's not going to be helpful to you. That's just buying time. That is a tactic. They're not trying to help you. They're trying to wait until you graduate and then hire some like conservative Trump supporters to get stuff back on track. Because that is another thing that I learned, the tea, is that like after they have radical years in schools, they like shift their admissions tactics so that they can't have like continued like radical engagement. And like at Harvard, we actually really do, the thing that will be used to silence you the most is actually because it's what makes you most powerful. And it's that like, you're a coddled Harvard student. What do you know about oppression? That's actually why you have a responsibility to be drawing the connections between what's happening in Harvard and what's happening in prison. Because you go to Harvard, because you go to this institution that is famous and has this reputation, your level of engagement when Jarrett or when the prison divestment folks like drop a banner in front of the Harvard president, that's national news. That's not true when you're incarcerated and you go on hunger strike in Mississippi. Like, that doesn't garner the same level of care, awareness, or just like national attention. So I would just say, anything that happens behind closed doors is not helpful to you. Anything that's supposed to study is a lie. What I found out at Harvard, because I was learning these lessons as I went, is they were like, oh, we're going to do a racial climate study. Then we found out that they had done the exact same racial climate study with the exact same company like 6 years before and just buried the results. But like, that was their solution to this. So run away from all of that stuff. And at every single moment, you need to organize where you are. There's nothing shameful about organizing Harvard students to talk about why Harvard is bad. That is actually an extraordinarily important lane in this movement, but you always need to be tying connections to what's happening in Harvard and what's happening in our communities at home, what's happening in jails and prison cells, what's happening in immigrant detention centers, because that's how we win.
I so agree with everything Rena just said. I just want to add, and it's related to that I think a strategy that I think is not working is actually giving the benefit of the doubt to institutions or to anyone on their payroll that didn't prove that they have earned it. Like, no kind of moral argument is going to work with those people. And I think the things that have most worked is actually shaming them and like cornering them publicly. That's the only way they will respond and do the right thing. And it's unfortunate, but they really don't have any kind of moral decency at all. And to the question of wellness, I guess for me, it's mostly fellow organizers and friends. Basically, like, I think we spend so much time talking about everything we are fighting against. Like, I think it's important also to remind that there are people around us that kind of remind us every day that other ways of relating to people are possible, that generosity and decency actually exist. And that's what I hold on to when I'm organizing and facing those institutions.
I would say, to respond to the first question about how can white and non-Black allies help the most, I think it's sort of to a point I made earlier of like, these issues are not Black issues. And I think it's really, really important for people to remember that, because the movement right now is referred to as Black Lives Matter, but it's essentially saying that there are people who are not being treated as people. And so I think that it's easy for non-Black students on campuses like Harvard to, maybe they don't feel as comfortable in a space because it's predominantly Black. Well, remember, that's how Black students feel every day at institutions like Harvard. So I would encourage you to attend our events. Our events are always open to all students. I think it's important to assume a role of listening rather than trying to lead the discussion. But I think the best thing you can do is to go into spaces where you may feel like you're the minority or feel uncomfortable and just listen. I think it's also a really important point that someone made earlier is how institutions like Harvard can keep doing what they're doing because their student turnover every 4 years or so, every 3 years in the case of law school. And so I think the most powerful thing that organizers can do is to build lasting organizations or lasting institutions within Harvard, and make sure that their students will carry that forward, because it's really easy for organizers to get burned out, and it's really easy for us, especially as students. We have busy schedules and we're taking classes. So I think the best thing you can do is to form coalitions. In the college, you can make a registered student group, to do things like that, so that they are officially, they're forced to be recognized by Harvard, whether Harvard likes it or not. And that can continue even after we graduate, and students can carry the torch forward.
Oh, okay. I'll be really quick. Yeah, I think to the first question about what white and non-Black allies can do is, I agree with Samantha, listening. And I think that like Black people are leading, and it won't be hard to figure out what you need to do if you're actively listening. And in terms of both like organizing on campus and self-care, I think one thing that I have learned is that like showing up is really the hardest part. And then like once I get there, I like feel energized by the relationships that I have with people and the work that I'm doing. And that's not to say that like if you like can't go to a meeting, like, or if you feel burned out, like not to take space. But I think more often than not, I've been thinking, oh my gosh, I really don't like want to go to this meeting. And then I go, and then I get so much from it, in ways that feel like I'm being cared for by the people that I'm working with. And that also, once again, like replenishes that hope and that imagination for the future.
Yes, thank you all so much for passing on all these bits about your knowledge, your experience, right? Not waiting to sort of, sort of the fact that the university oftentimes uses protraction to stall efforts. The fact that our organizing needs to be, there's always space for white and non-Black folks, but a lot of these conversations need to be sort of Black-led, or the voices of Black folks need to be centered. And to Azani's point, I'm gonna wrap it up real quick. I'm gonna ask one last question and then we can be out. But Azani's point about the fact that, right, good organizing spaces are spaces where we care about each other, where we care for each other, where we check in. So to close it out, I guess the last question I would have is, how can folks who are on this call right now stay in touch, get involved, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Y'all wanna shout out some information?
Christelle just dropped our info in the chat if you want to get connected virtually. We're also having a month of programming, Freedom Month. It's wrapping up next week with oral arguments for the lawsuit. This is a unique opportunity for everybody to join in and like watch the lawsuit, something that wouldn't be able to happen if it was in person. And so we're also having a Q&A session on Monday, the day before the oral arguments, and then Tuesday are asking people to join in and watch if they can. And I will put the link to register in the chat. Also, if you're interested in joining HPDC, just like email us. I'll also put the email, or reach out to us on Twitter, Facebook, etc.
I would say that I just dropped the link for the Harvard Free Renty Coalition. We welcome all students and non-students alike to visit our website and sign the petition to Free Renty, which is now thousands of signatures. And we're always looking for students to submit video essays to President McCow, telling him, or video messages telling him why Harvard should turn over the images. So feel free to find us on that website and to support us in these next few weeks leading up to the case.
I don't go there anymore, so I don't have anything to promote. But I will say, I just want to say to the white I didn't answer like the white question because quite honestly it annoys me, but I get it. But I will say that like at the end of the day, if you care deeply about these issues, like get involved, because there's absolutely no reason why your Black and brown classmates should be engaging in actions to free Black people and then being threatened with disciplinary actions. Like if you're white and your dad is like on the board, then like do it. You need to like do the escalations. You can do it. You can weather the storm. You will be in community with folks that have your back. But like it is about putting skin in the game. And like there are a lot of ways that your classmates who have a less capital in that school put skin in the game. So don't just come in there and be like, I'm gonna save y'all, but like be in relationship with folks, be in love, study, and struggle with folks, and be just ready to make sacrifices the way that like Black and brown people are making sacrifices every day without having the privilege of getting to choose like when to opt in and out.
See period in the chats. I think that's probably a good way to wrap up this event. Thank you so much to all of our panelists on the student organizing panel. I'm going to give y'all a round of applause. Thank you so much, Ms. Lanier and other Ms. Lanier, Ms. Tamara and Ms. Shamrell. Thank everyone who took some time out of their day this Friday to learn a little bit more about and to really start having a conversation about how to keep supporting these folks who are doing this work and pressuring the university for accountability.
Thanks, everyone.